We are in Module 7, which is the first module in Week 4. And in this module, we're going to be covering Chapter 8, which is Nutrition, Weight Control, Diet, Exercise, and Safety. So it's sort of a lot of topics packed into one chapter. We spend a lot more of the time talking about nutrition, exercise, their importance on us psychologically, physically, as well as physiologically. And we also talk about some of the challenges of weight control and diet. Probably a little less about the safety part, although that comes into play when we start talking about primary prevention. So here's your to-do list for the week. Your objectives, and we also will be covering Module 3, which is the digestive system, which appropriately fits along nicely with this chapter. So just remember, as you're working your way through the chapter, you're going to get to the part in the chapter where it tells you, hey, stop here. If you haven't read the digestive system yet, you're going to want to go ahead and do that. So just really quickly, we'll be covering diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, distinguishing between the two, how one acquires type 1 and type 2 diabetes, what to do when you have it, so really looking at secondary prevention, and then as well, what happens if it goes untreated or it gets out of control. What are some of the resulting illnesses? We'll be looking at understanding the health outcomes of diabetes, and then as well, why adherence is so hard for a diabetic. Diabetes is one of the hardest regimens to control and to monitor because it is so intricate and involves not only one's diet but also exercise. So we'll talk a lot about the self-management of diabetes as well as what psychosocial factors play a role. Most of the diabetic care that goes on has to do with coping. So we'll be looking at how people cope with the disease and how that differs for people depending upon who they are. So children versus adolescents versus older adults all have various challenges with diabetic care. Then we'll be breaking down food, looking at the components of food, so talking about things like carbohydrates and proteins and metabolism, as well as the 6 basic food groups, distinguishing also between what people are eating versus what people should be eating. So looking at some of the foods that are currently a part of our popular American diet that aren't very healthy, some of the hidden dangers in the foods that we're eating, as well as what can we be eating, what is healthy. And I know that the chapter has diet in the title, but it's really more about healthy lifestyle, not dieting per se. But our diet is really the crux of how our body operates. We'll also be looking at mass media campaigns to eating healthier. So this is like primary prevention 101. What we eat is a way of being preventative in our healthcare, and eating healthier can be a challenge. The media plays a big role in whether or not we eat healthy. And so then we'll be taking a look at how that all affects us interpersonally, culturally, and so forth. We'll also be trying to explain the link between diet and atherosclerosis, which is basically heart disease, plaques in the arteries, as well as a link between diet and hypertension. Hypertension is a precursor to heart disease, as well as many other diseases, and it's often the step of secondary prevention. If you have hypertension, the goal is not to have a heart attack, but to manage the hypertension, the high blood pressure, And so you're really looking at it from a secondary prevention perspective. We'll also be looking at the links between diet and cancer. So those are the two main disease states that are linked to our diet, cancer and heart disease, which are two of the three largest killers in the U.S. of people today. We'll look at the definitions of being overweight versus being obese. Along with that, some of the sociocultural aspects of obesity, such as age, gender, race, socioeconomic status, and then looking at the role of heredity. So biologically, how are we wired perhaps for obesity? And I think we'll spend a great deal more time looking at all the psychosocial factors that are involved in weight control. A person who is trying to control their weight has many barriers. These could be mental, emotional, physical, or just tangible hardships that stand in the way to weight control. There are definitely ways that we can prevent obesity. Preventing it is easier than going backwards and trying to reverse it. So we'll look at how, as a society, we can prevent obesity. And that's really one of the top goals of a health psychologist working in an applied setting, is to come up with campaigns and strategies that help patients or help young people to do this before they become obese. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at treatments to lose weight. So we'll talk about fad diets versus good old exercise, and then as well as some of the behavioral and cognitive methods, which we'll get into, like the self-help groups, and then medically supervised approaches that might be used. We'll touch on anorexia and bulimia, as well as what are the origins with both those disorders and how are they treated, and then spend the rest of the chapter on pretty much exercise, the physiological and psychological benefits of it, what's lacking in exercise today, and the ways in which we as a society can help promote exercise and overall healthier living. And then, as you can see, the very last objective deals with the prevalence of accidents and environmental hazards faced by individuals today. So that's where the safety part comes in. It taps onto primary prevention. Okay, and so that does it for the chapter 8. And again, you'll be covering the digestive system from chapter 2. So again, you just want to understand the process of how the body breaks down food and digests it. What does that look like? The module has some diagrams of that. Being familiar with the various disorders and disease states that affect the digestive system, as well as how this system works with other systems that maybe we've already talked about to do its job. So understanding the basic mechanics of metabolism. So for example, what's a calorie? What is basal metabolic rate? How does that operate? How does it have to do with our eating and our level of activity, and so forth? So that does it for this module. Here are the lecture slides. I have a video assignment that is really for the week. It's a video on obesity. It's called The Weight of Obesity, and it touches on just all the psychosocial aspects of being overweight, the challenges that come with that, and how as a society we're sort of primed for it. And that's sad to say, but a lot of the fault is placed on the individual, and really as a culture we pretty much promote overeating. So it's just a really interesting look at obesity. So you want to watch the video. You would click here, and then this here is a Word document worksheet that you can follow along with the video. You're going to want to fill that out, and then you're going to click on this assignment link when you're ready to submit it. It's worth 10 points, and it's due on the 4th. So you'll have that. and then you'll have your Module 7 discussion. And for this week, we're looking at nice parallel here in the longevity project. How physically active are you? And this is a tricky one. It's really, the assessment for this chapter is asking you about what you do physically. And you got to remember that this was asked of the termites. So some of the activities are a little outdated. This is the original scale that was given to them. So the challenge is for you is as you're going through the scale and you're trying to decide, do I do this? Like, do I play tennis? Do I garden? Obviously, some of those things are things you're not doing or are not relevant to you. Try to think of a current activity that maybe you're doing that might expend about the same amount of energy as an activity that you see on the list, and just use that. Okay, so like they didn't have CrossFit back in the 40s and 50s. What might CrossFit compare to on the scale that they were given? Try to find an equivalent and just use that. So you're really just mapping on the activities that you do in a typical day, and then you're assigning a value to them, which is your the MET equivalent. Metabolic, it just stands for metabolic equivalent. So when I'm doing a certain activity, how many units am I expending from my metabolism? That's what it's trying to calculate. How much of my metabolic rate is getting higher when I do a certain activity. So do your best in calculating those and assigning those. Really, it's just looking to gauge how active you are. So you're going to want to score yourself following the assessment, interpret your score. So once you get that score, what does it mean? What does it mean about you according to what they say in the longevity project? And do you think it's accurate? And what does that have to do with health and longevity overall? Okay. Once you've done that part of the assessment, then you can answer these questions here about some of the conclusions from the term and data set. And again, as you're answering these questions, be thinking of ways to link to the reading, the main reading in Chapter 8. So support what you're saying by using lots of examples and citing and supporting your work as you go. And that does it for Module 7.